One night, my friend and I decided to camp out in an old military annex located in central Alabama. It's no longer accessible to the general public, but during its operational days, there were reports of some unusual occurrences in the area. My friend wanted to go hunt for Bigfoot out there. I've been teasing him for days leading up to it, but as we made our way to the site, he told me that he actually caught a glimpse of Bigfoot a week before while he was out exploring the area. The area is probably about 4 square miles in size and enclosed by a fence with only 2 entrances. There were multiple bunkers scattered throughout the vicinity, and some other random buildings, and even some graveyards. We made our way toward the area we were most familiar with. It was situated on a hill and gave us a good vantage point overlooking the nearby road. As we were setting up our campsite, we caught sight of what I first assumed to be a small wolf or an oversized coyote. I had encountered both of those things before, but I couldn't be certain since this animal seemed different than either of those. It was about 3 feet tall when it was on all fours, and its gray-brown color had me leaning towards some type of wolf. We tossed rocks into the woods to scare it off, but it pretty much just stayed still. Usually, coyotes will run off at any noise. Anyway, we got our camp set up and it was getting dark, so it was time to go squatching. We set out and probably had only covered about 1,000 feet before we heard a rustling coming from the nearby bushes. We were straining our eyes, trying to see through the undergrowth, and something human-like stepped onto the road. It was hard to see, but we could tell it was standing upright. It was tall, but it definitely wasn't 8 feet tall like people say Bigfoot is, so we didn't put it into the Bigfoot category. Sometimes homeless people would squat in the old bunkers and outbuildings in the annex, so we honestly thought we saw a squatter stumbling down the road. He was walking the opposite direction of us and didn't seem to notice us. He got to the top of the hill where our camp was and kept going down the other side. We wanted to keep going, but we thought we should go back to make sure he hadn't messed with our campsite. Our campsite looked undisturbed, so we set out again. After another half an hour, we started to hear what sounded like rhythmic footsteps of a bipedal creature coming from the woods about 50 feet to our right. We started feeling really nervous, so we ended up running back to our campsite, scampering away like a couple of cowards. But when we got back there, things started getting weird. Suddenly, we found ourselves being bombarded with rocks, being hurled in our direction. We started hearing lots of limbs creaking and snapping in the woods behind us, and some strange animal sounds started coming out of the woods in this weird rhythmic way. Anyway, we decided we'd prefer to get out of there, so we were running around packing up all of our stuff. Then, on the way out, at the very last crossroads you have to pass to get out of there, we saw something stride out of the woods. It was about 5 to 6 feet tall and was covered head to toe in matted, dark fur. It wasn't very tall, but it had these big, bulging muscles, and the stench it put out was overwhelming, like really bad, skunky body odor. Its face was hidden behind a bunch of hair, but I swear I caught a glimpse of these piercing, almost reddish eyes looking at us. It seemed to size us up. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared back into the trees. We needed to go straight, but instead, we made a left to avoid passing by that spot, and it took us another half an hour to make it out of that place. But we were really booking it. We stayed completely silent until we had left the area and made it back to my house. I only lived a couple of miles away at the time. My friend was adamant that the creature we saw was none other than Bigfoot, but I wasn't totally convinced. Mostly we were just in total disbelief that we had seen whatever it was. After a little time had passed, by trying to convince myself I had seen some kind of bear or something. They used to be pretty common around here, and people still see them sometimes a little further north. Like I mentioned, I lived about 2 miles away from the annex. A road was being built that went past my house and led to the entrance of it. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my porch and I started hearing these rhythmic thumping sounds. I started to scan the woods around my house, looking for the source, when I saw a pair of eyes looking at me out of the bushes, maybe 5 or 6 feet off of the ground. They seemed like they were almost glowing in the light that reflected off of them. They stayed perfectly still for about 30 seconds and then slowly backed away until they were gone. I didn't know what the hell to do. I did a lot of research, and at the time, it started really making sense to me that it was Bigfoot. So I filed a report with the Bigfoot Research Organization to get a record of it out there. While I was at it, I also reported the thing we saw at the annex. They were telling me this stuff about baby Bigfoots, likely to mess with humans, and that I shouldn't be worried unless I saw a pair of eyes 8 or 9 feet off of the ground. That didn't seem that comforting to me. I mean, if a baby Bigfoot is around, the parents are probably not too far away, right? Since then, I've moved a couple of hours away from the area, and I haven't seen it since. I have dreams about it sometimes, but I would rather not ever encounter it. I've been a trooper with the Highway Patrol in the great state of Texas for 12 years, and I can tell you, I've seen some things. But this thing that I'm telling you about, it's something I haven't dared to tell anyone, not even my commanding officer. Now, our traffic, well, it's not exactly New York level, but it can get bad in the Metroplex. A lot of our highways are like arteries, leading out from the central heart of the major cities. They lead out into a whole lot of nothing, and a lot of my time is taken up with patrolling that nothing. Breakdowns can and do happen in rural areas, and some places are far enough out that cell reception can be downright impossible. And while a car's inoperable on the side of the road, all sorts of things can happen. We're talking running into a human trafficker or drug smuggling, critter trouble, just a normal day in the life, if you're me. But the normal stuff isn't why I'm telling you this. The weird stuff is. There are always things that happen in the middle of nowhere that just plain don't make much sense. Things like a strange reflective light from out in the dark hills that gives you the willies for a minute. It always turns out to be coyotes or a deer. Or when you come up on what looks like an abandoned car, but the driver's just pulled over to sleep. Not that it matters, because honestly, there's not much difference between a sleeping person and a fresh body for a minute under the beam of your flashlight. These are all things that are normal in the line of duty, but given the circumstances, they still feel uncanny. Every time, just that split second, your heart always thumps and you wonder, what is that? I wondered that a lot one night. My patrol route normally takes me on the highways between DFW and San Angelo in the west part of the state. On this night, dispatch had gotten a call for a car that had gone off the road, so I was on alert for a stranded motorist. Stranded car calls are common, and I always play the game of I wonder what the problem is this time when I get one. Could have been any one of a handful of reasons for the trouble. The most usual one is road debris puncturing a tire. Most people can change a flat, but sometimes their spare was flat too, or so old that it couldn't be used, or the kind of car trouble that needs a mechanic. Who knew? Driving that lonely stretch of road, you see a lot of wide open sky and not much else. I remember my headlights punching through the dark. The chatter on the radio background noise, that one part of my brain paid attention to, while I was focusing on looking for the stranded car. I found it about halfway to nowhere, off on the shoulder. At first glance, it didn't seem too bad. I could tell by the long skid marks that they had slammed on the brakes for some reason, but I couldn't immediately see anything that would make that necessary. Of course, there could have been an animal crossing the road, but I didn't see any blood on the asphalts or any damage to the car. I parked my cruiser about 3 car lengths behind the stranded truck, lights on and strobing that blue and red. That's either comforting or intimidating, depending on who you ask and what you're pulling them over for. I had my flashlight on and my hand on my weapon, just in case. As I approached the car, I could see a male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, bearded, wearing a gimme hat and glasses. He was sitting in his seat, hands clearly visible on the steering wheel, which I appreciated, even though this wasn't a traffic stop. I waited until he clearly saw who I was and the badge before I tapped on the glass with the rim of my flashlight. And that's when I got a weird feeling. This guy was clearly a local boy, big and strong, and not a youngster with too much piss and vinegar in him for his own good. He looked freaked out, eyes big and a face that was pale and shiny with sweat. What in the world was going on? When you're a trooper, one of the first things you do is make sure that what you think you're dealing with is actually what you're dealing with. And from how nervous this guy looked, I think I was justified in wondering if this was a setup and there was someone waiting out in the dark to jump me, none of which made my hand move from my weapon, I promise you. I signaled him to hold on with one finger and took a couple of steps away from the truck and back toward my patrol vehicle, sweeping the surrounding area with my flashlight. Tactical mag lights are powerful, but I didn't see anything weird in the scrub either side of the road. Alright then, I stepped back to the driver's side and tapped on the glass again. He rolled down the window, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Did you see it?" Not what I was expecting, sure, and I had to tell him no, I hadn't. I didn't ask what made him run off the road. He told me that a blue car had come roaring out of nowhere, going at least 90, and hadn't taken advantage of the empty road to go around him. It had stayed right on his bumper. The lights had been so bright that he had swerved off to the dirt shoulder to get away from it and skidded out. That was odd, the way the truck was sitting. I should have seen the skid in the dirt, and it should have been stopped oddly, but it wasn't. That weird feeling came back as I listened to his story, so I asked again if that was the whole thing. It wasn't. He said he'd gotten back on the road once the other driver had gone ahead. His ranch was about an hour away from where he'd originally stopped, which wasn't here. He had driven another 10 miles before he saw headlights coming up behind him again. They came up right behind him, like right on his tail, bright and blinding. I wasn't sure how that would have happened because there was no real way to get ahead of this truck, get off the highway, and get back on fast enough to catch up with them. Which made me wonder if I had a few bored ranch kids out joyriding and causing problems. I asked if he'd seen enough of the other vehicle to know what it was, so I could call in an APB. I knew it was a long shot because of the strength of the headlights, but figured I'd ask. Turns out he had, because the other car had gotten tired of riding his bumper and swerved left to come alongside him. Risky behavior, since he was running in the oncoming lane. But given that, so far, I hadn't been impressed with this troublesome driver's common sense. But I also wasn't surprised. It was a blue car, an old late 50s Ford, which did surprise me. Most people with classic cars don't drive like maniacs. I had to ask if he'd gotten a look at the driver or passenger, and that's when his face went even paler. He looked so bloodless, I worried if he was having a heart attack. He'd seen the driver, but it couldn't have been real, he said. Because real people don't look like that. He had to have been wearing a mask. From the description, it sounded like one hell of a Halloween mask. Hollow eyes, mouth open, melting flesh, and a permanent scream. Definitely not something you want to see driving alone in the middle of the night on a deserted road, where the loneliness makes even tough country boys think they're seeing crazy stuff. I walked back to my cruiser to call in an APB on a late 50s blue Ford sedan and let them know that the driver had been apparently wearing a Halloween mask before I went back to the stalled truck to see what I could do to get it going again. One tire change later, which the driver clearly could have done on his own, but apparently hadn't want to get out of his truck to do it while he was alone, and he was on his way. I sat in my cruiser for another minute, letting dispatch know that the stranded motorist was no longer stranded. The night was quiet, and the only thing on the road besides me was a bobcat that decided to cross the road. I was honestly surprised to hear the roar of an engine from somewhere behind me. It was a full throttle sound, getting louder and louder fast. I knew I couldn't be as lucky as all that whoever was playing tricks on the highway in the middle of the night would be trying this with a Texas state trooper. But then that engine roared, turning into a blazing bright headlights, just like the stranded driver had said. The car, definitely a 1950s Ford Edsel sedan, rocketed past me fast enough that the air displacement rocked my vehicle. I flipped on my lights and siren, peeled out, getting back on the road, and gunned it after that car. It was going 90 if it was going anything, and I had to work to catch up. Fortunately, my headlights were bright enough to make out the license plate, so I called it in to ask for a plate run. It wasn't a modern plate, which isn't unusual with a classic car, but is weird if you want to be able to drive the thing legally. Most people pull over when there's a marked cop chasing them. Not this guy. He just kept going, never letting up from that dangerous speed. I was grateful for the empty highway and the open stretch of land around us. I didn't want to think of how this would end if I couldn't stop him. I must have chased him for another 10 miles before dispatch got back to me that nothing had come up on the plate. The only record they had was over 50 years old. I knew I'd been lucky so far that no one else was driving this late at night, but that wasn't a guarantee that I was going to stay lucky. I knew I had to end this pursuit. I gunned my engine and was able to catch up to the Edsel. This close, I could see that the car wasn't just powder blue. The paint was rusting in some spots, and the rear window was cracked. The driver's side mirror was hanging loose. It was a miracle it didn't fly off and hit me smack in the windshield. I could see movement through that cracked rear window, but it was hard to tell because of all the dirt on it. I pulsed the siren again, just in case the driver really didn't get the message, and then pulled into the oncoming lane in order to get ahead of him. It's a risky move, but I didn't see how I could stop him otherwise. I couldn't hear the radio chatter over the roar of that land boat's engine, but I was able to pull up alongside him. The side of the car was in worse shape than the rear had been. There were more rust spots, big ones. How this car was being held together was beyond me. I managed to get ahead of him and let him run up to my bumper so I could start applying the brakes for the both of us. But he slowed down just enough to make getting around me possible, and then we were back at it. Me chasing him down this lonely stretch of West Texas road. There was only one thing I could think of to do. I pulled up alongside him and forced him off the road. That Edsel went bouncing into the scrub at the side of the road. This driver given me nothing but trouble, and I was half expecting him to peel out and start the chase all over again. But the car didn't move. I made sure I parked my vehicle a bit behind him. If he ran again, at least he wouldn't be able to run me over. I approached the car with my weapon drawn. My instincts were howling at me that something was way off. The night was quiet, except for the pinging of the engines as they cooled, but I was sweating. As I approached the car, I realized I hadn't really seen the extent of damage to this thing. It was more holes than car body, and more orangey brown rust than powder blue paint. Windows were still dirty and cracked, though I couldn't easily see inside. I shouted for the driver to come out with their hands up, but there was no answer. There was nothing. No noise. Just those cooling car sounds and the background squawk of my radio. After a couple of minutes of a silent standoff, I decided to see if I could see the driver. I shouted at him that I was going to approach the vehicle and to keep his hands on the wheel. As I pulled my mag light off my belt, I brought my weapon and light together, so whatever I could see, I could also shoot as necessary. I swept the light up over the Edsel's body. In good light, the damage looked ridiculous, and into the back seat. If I'd thought that the exterior was damaged, I tell you, the interior was worse. It was a charred mess. I moved the light to the driver's side window. I could see through to the passenger side, where there were white cracked leather seats and some weird scraps of cloth that looked like they were torn from somebody's grandmother's cardigan. I moved my light right to see if I could spot the driver. All of a sudden, there was a face pressed against the dirty glass, narrow-eyed and tanned the way ranchers are, with slicked back hair in a style that hasn't seen use in over 70 years. He had been in his late teens or maybe early 20s at the most, and he stared at me with an absolutely dead expression. Behind him, in the dark car, I could see an orange glow start. There was no sign of flame from the engine. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, but God's honest truth, I wasn't much thinking about how logical this was. The flame grew from a glow to a bonfire in the space of 2 breaths. I shouted at the kid to get out of there, but he just stared at me through that filthy window. I saw the fire fill the car impossibly fast, saw his hair catch, and suddenly his mouth opened in what had to be a blood-curdling scream. Except there was no sound. When the flash started melting off his face, I was the one screaming, scrambling back to my cruiser. I don't know what I was going to do, and it was still completely quiet. No feel of heat, no roar of flame, no screaming, no nothing. Just a silent Texas spring night and whatever was happening on the side of the highway to San Angelo. When I looked again, there was no sign of the 1950s powder blue Edsel, just a big scorch mark in the dirt on the side of the road. If I ever figured out what happened, maybe I'll tell you. But for now, I'm still trying to forget everything. After months of meticulous planning and preparation, I finally embarked on my journey to the illustrious country of South Africa. I eagerly looked forward to experiencing the rich tapestry of the country's diverse lifestyle. I had heard of the many exotic creatures that inhabit the land, and my expectations were set high. But never in my wildest dreams did I expect to encounter such a marvel. The sight that greeted me there was absolutely awe-inspiring. A humongous, luminescent creature that stood 7 feet tall. Man resembled a fish, but not like one I'd ever seen before in my life. Its bright green glow illuminated the surrounding waters, and the breathtaking sight left me dumbfounded. My heart raced with excitement, and my eyes widened with wonder at the spectacle before me. Never in my life had I seen such a creature, and the experience was truly one of a kind. South Africa is a superb place, and I highly encourage anyone who can make the trip to do so. However, do so at your own peril and exercise extreme caution. As I was taking a walk along the Mtslava River, I saw something in the water that looked like a giant fish. It was glowing bright green, and it had to have been at least 7 feet tall. I was in awe and couldn't take my eyes off of it. As I gazed upon the creature's bioluminescent glow, I couldn't believe my eyes. The bright green light emanating from its body was so intense that it seemed to light up the entire river and the surrounding forest. It was as if a beacon had been set ablaze, and everything within its reach was bathed in this eerie, otherworldly glow. The trees, the rocks, and even the fish swimming in the water seemed to be under its spell. I felt both awe and fear at the sight, wondering how something so mesmerizing could also be so terrifying. It was a sight that would stay with me forever, etched into my memory like a vivid dream that I would never forget. As I was returning from my thrilling adventures in South Africa, I found myself sitting alone at a bar, sipping a refreshing drink. It was then that I met an enthralling woman who caught my eye with her enchanting beauty. As we talked, I couldn't help but regale her stories of my incredible encounters. Unable to contain my excitement, we continued the conversation back at my hotel room and had some exciting adventures of our own. As we lay in bed sipping wine and swapping stories, she stopped me in my tracks with a tale of her own. She spoke of a creature so fearsome and otherworldly that even the bravest men would tremble in its presence. This creature, known as the Mamlambo, had said to dwell in the murky depths of the Minslava River, and its bioluminescent glow could light up the entire river and surrounding forest. As she spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine, and I knew that we had witnessed the same thing. It dawned on me how closely I came to death's cold embrace, and her words stayed with me long after that night, haunting my thoughts and dreams, and forever changing my perception of the world around me. Upon finally returning home, I couldn't shake the memory of the Mamlambo from my mind. I was filled with this insatiable curiosity about this mysterious creature, and I knew I had to learn more. I immediately began my investigation, delving deeper into the creature's rich history. With each passing day, my obsession grew stronger, and I found myself consumed with the desire to uncover every detail I could possibly find about the Mamlambo. I scoured through old tales, spoke to those who had encountered the creature, and spent many sleepless nights scouring the bowels of the internet to discover what I could about the legendary Mamlambo. I persisted, driven by an unyielding desire to discover the truth behind this legendary creature. The more I learned, the more intrigued I became, and my quest for knowledge continued unabated. According to my vigorous research, the Mamlambo, or brainsucker, as it's so lovingly referred to, is a quasi-reptilian monstrosity that terrorized villages around South Africa and was notorious for its grisly and macabre methods of killing. It would drag its unfortunate victims into the murky depths of the river, where they would drown before the Mamlambo proceeded to crack open their skulls and siphon out their brains and blood. It was a horrifying image that haunted me, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I read more about this infamous creature. Its methods of killing were reportedly reminiscent of a European cousin, Duartiku, another aquatic monster that terrorized the shores of Ireland. Nonetheless, the Mamlambo was a true predator, lurking in the depths and waiting for its next unsuspecting victim to come along. My research of this creature revealed the wrath of a truly terrifying beast that I was glad to have survived on my travels to South Africa. Reflecting on my encounter with the Mamlambo, I can't help but think about the life-changing experience it brought me. Not only did it teach me to be more cautious in my explorations, but it also opened my very eyes to the extraordinary and often terrifying world we live in. And that woman I met at the bar, how she was like a breath of fresh air, a beautiful muse who inspired a new level of curiosity in me. Because of her, I spent countless hours researching the Mamlambo, delving deep into the lore and mythology surrounding this quasi-reptilian monster. And through this research that she inspired, I gained an entirely new outlook on life itself. I learned to appreciate the unexpected, to embrace the unknown, and to never stop seeking out new experiences. So, while my encounter with the Mamlambo, had it gone differently, may have been terrifying, it ultimately led me down a path of self-discovery and enlightenment that I will forever be grateful